Shalom. We are in the 37th chapter of Beshirit, or Genesis. Picking up where we left off last week, we've been working through week by week, going through a different section of Torah, as is tradition. Last week we talked about the descendants of Esau. We talked about the importance of not forgetting, as I said last week, the cousin who lives across the field. We talked about how if we as a people had not forgotten where we came from, if we were not so proud to be sons of Yaakov, sons of Yisrael, and forget that we are also sons of Yitzhak and sons of Abraham, then we would have known that the man who took the name Edom, although he did it for wrong reasons, we would know that he also had a place of blessing at the table of the son of promise, and that his descendants are as much the descendants of Abraham as we are, and that we are to tell them in love what Torah is, that we are to tell them in love that there is a Mashiach who has come to make right the world and is coming again to complete that job. But too often we lose that because we get prideful in who we are. So this week we start off in chapter 37. It says, "Now Yaakov was settled in the land where his father had sojourned, the land of the Canaanite." Okay, so we see that the promise has come full circle. And he told in an earlier portion, he told Elohim, he said, if I go to Padan Aram, to the home of my uncle, if I find a wife there, if I come home and I'm allowed to live here and dwell here, if you bless me in that way, then you will be my Elohim. He didn't tell Yehovah, if you do all of this, you will be the Elohim of my father. He was already the Elohim of his father. He was already the Elohim of his grandfather. But he said, if you will do this, if you will show me who you are in this personal way, then I will have no way of doubting who you are, and I will belong to you, and you will be my Elohim. And we see that it has come full circle. He and his wives and his children have come back into the land, literally where his father sojourned. It says, this then is the line of Yaakov. Last week we talked about the line of Esau. This then is the line of Yaakov. At 17 years of age, Yosef tended the flocks. Think about that. At 17 years of age, Yosef tended the flocks. Shouldn't it say Reuben? Okay, we're talking about a patrilineal lineage, an inheritance, a promise, and a covenant that is handed down from father to son, father to son, father to son. And yet once again, we see, what does he say? At 17 years of age, Yosef tended the flocks with his brother. How is that? Why would that be the way that we trace the lineage? Let me tell you something. If you understand the prophecies of the houses, okay, you will understand that one of the two houses, they talk about the two tribes and the 10 lost tribes, right? And I tell you, it's actually 2.5 and 9.5 if you really look at it, because Levi got divided between the two. But if you look at the greater number of Yisraelim in the world today, most don't even know who they are. Some are being woken up to their spiritual identities, but they've lost it, and they have to find it again. It has to be shown to them. And these whether biologically such or not all of them are, but they are called by a name, Ephraim. Okay, throughout prophecy, the house of Ephraim is a term used to reference those so-called lost tribes, and they're not lost. They're right here with us. All you have to do is know how to identify the names, the surnames that they took when they went into the outlying areas. But Ephraim, down the road from here, is a son of Yusef. So when we say that they belong to Ephraim, we're saying that they belong to Yusef. And spiritually they do, because of what we're about to see happen to Yusef in this chapter. He's going to go out from his father's home, not by his will, but by force. We'll get to that. And that is what happened to the 9.5 tribes. It says he tended the flocks with his brothers as a helper to the sons. You hear that? He was a helper to the sons of his father's wives, Bilhah and Zilpah. And Yusef brought bad reports of them to their father. You know, I read that, when I first read that, I wasn't even a believer yet. And I read that and I said, what a brat. Sure, the little brother's going to run home and tell dad everything that the older brothers are doing wrong. What was actually happening was he was being more loyal. He was being more faithful. He knew that what was being done would not be pleasing to his father, and he wanted to be pleasing to his father, and that shows later on in his life. Now, Yisrael loved Yusef best of all of his sons. Now, we've seen this happen before. We saw this with Abraham had a favorite. Yitzhak had a favorite. Now, Yaakov has a favorite. Did it work out well the other 2 times? No. Is it going to work out wonderfully this time? No. Let's scratch those 2 answers. Let's make them yes and yes, because we say no because we look through carnal eyes. But if we read this with the heart that we should have as believers, we see that what happens in every one of these cases is an example of Elohim having both a perfect will and a permissive will. He has a perfect will in which certain things are going to happen. He has a permissive will in which we get to do what we want to do. And he says, well, if that's really what you want to do, you really want to mess things up and make it harder on yourselves, I guess you can do that. But in the end, it's kind of like we tie it up in a knot and he pulls both ends and shows us a slip knot, and he still gets what he set out to get in the first place. It was just hard for us. We made it difficult. I used to be told all the time, God is difficult. And I said, no, God is simple. People are difficult. Okay, we make things harder on ourselves than what they ought to be. For he was the child of his old age, and he had made him an ornamented tunic. Now, this is an interesting thing, this ornamented tunic. We hear it all the time in the mainline churches. They always said, oh, he had a coat of many colors. His father gave it to him because he loved him most. That's not what the Hebrew says. Okay, this isn't even a really what I would call a pure translation of the Hebrew. The Hebrew says that he had a tunic of bands, and the type of bands that seems to indicate there is metallic bands. This was not, he just had the cool clothes. This was tantamount in that time period to a king looking at all of his sons and say, I'm going to let this one wear my armor. This was the ensign, the signal, the sign to who he preferred to eventually have charge over all that was his. Now do you see why it's an interesting situation that it's not Reuben? Because Reuben was the eldest. And when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of his brothers, now we're in trouble. They hated him so that they could not speak a friendly word to him. You know, we read this and we think, what a terrible thing to have that in a family structure, especially such a large family that should have been full of so much love and interdependence. It should have been so strong. And the younger brother was hated because he was loved. You know what? It goes on today. It goes on today. I want to believe that my children do not believe that one is loved more than the others, but I guarantee you, if you ask this one, he'll say it's that one. If you ask that one, she'll say it's a different one. Not because I love my children any one more than the others, but because I have a different relationship with every child. Okay? I don't have the same relationship with my 18-year-old son that I have with my 16-month-old daughter. Okay, I don't have the same relationship with my 13-year-old daughter that I have with my 11-year-old daughter, almost 12, but 11, because my 13-year-old daughter is at a different place in her life and needs different things from her father than what my 11-year-old daughter needs. Okay? And yet I try to show every one of them consistently love, and I'm sure still there are times when one will feel that another is loved more. But there are families, and I see this all the time, I see it in my work in mental health, there are families where I go into the home and usually this is the main thing that happens. It's a couple that got together after having other families, and like I'm thinking of one family that I deal with where her kids from before don't matter at all, and I see it. His kids from before are okay, but they're only in and out of the house on the weekends. And the children they have together, well, that's the family that they love. Okay? And it's not always that dynamic, but that's one that comes to mind. And what happens there is her children from the previous relationship resent the other children. And the other children feel entitled and think that they are better than her children from before. Okay? And that's a toxicity that destroys a family structure. But let me tell you what else happens. I see it in congregations. As I've traveled around and I've visited other fellowships of any denomination, you have believers who were born into families who helped start the congregation 100 years ago. And you have believers who came out of unbelieving families but are on fire but don't get treated with the same sort of love and respect as the people who just happen to be born into the right family who may not even be saved. But they're on the board because their dad was on the board. And their granddad was on the board. And their great-granddad built the building with his own two hands. Isn't it a blessed thing, a blessed, blessed thing to have as a father, to have as Abba, Yehovah, who loves you for you, who loves me for me, who loves what I do right and hates what I do wrong, but loves me? Isn't it just an awesome thought to know that if we love him back, he will give us that coat of bands, that he gives us an inheritance. Once Yusuf had a dream, which he told to his brothers, and they hated him even more. He said to them, "Hear this dream which I dreamed. There we were binding sheaves in the field, when suddenly my sheaf stood up and remained upright. Then your sheaves gathered around and bowed low to my sheaf." His brothers answered, "Do you mean to reign over us?" do you mean to rule over us? And they hated him even more for his talk about his dreams. You know, sometimes people read that and they say, why on earth would they hate him for his dreams? It's not his fault Elohim gave him something. But don't we see that among believers today? Don't we see when a believer is given a gift? Don't we see other people line up and say, who's he to use that gift? I'll never forget, I had a beloved brother. I literally loved this man to death. And just like I write spiritual devotionals, he wrote spiritual devotionals. I loved this man to the point I've traveled thousands of miles promoting his ministry just because I believed in it. And when he would come through Indiana, he would stay at my house. We would feed him. We would shelter him. He would stand in the pulpit wherever I was ministering. And one day, he happened to find out, and I don't even know how he found out, but he happened to find out that I sold many, many times the books that he sold. And he became angry. Angry because I was blessed. To this day, that hurts me. To this day, that pains my heart. Woe to us if we see another believer being blessed with a gift and using it, and we degrade that believer. Because he didn't only tell me that I didn't deserve to be blessed that way. He told other believers that my book should not be read. He was jealous. But you know what happened? He didn't just, and we're getting ready to see it here, he didn't just hurt me, he hurt himself. And he didn't just hurt himself, he hurt every believer he told those things to. He didn't just hurt the person he was jealous of, he hurt himself and everyone he touched when he was in that mindset. And we all do it. We are all guilty at some point in our lives of being jealous of what Elohim has given someone else. And we need to stop that. He dreamed another dream and told it to his brothers, saying, look, I have had another dream. And this time the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me. And when he told it to his father and brothers, his father berated him. What? He said to him, is this dream you have dreamed? Are we to come, I and your mother and your brothers, and bow low to you to the ground? So his brothers were wrought up at him, and his father kept the matter in mind. I want to show you there's two different reactions. First, I want to show you something. You remember when we went back in way back in the early part of Bashirit, we talked about there's times in Scripture, if you don't understand the poetic nature of Paleo-Hebrew, you miss, and people create false doctrines because they don't understand time frames. And we talked about how the second chapter of this book actually takes place during the first chapter of this book. Okay, and so it backed up and it retold part of the story for more clarification. This is one of those cases. We know this because obviously from the context, Rachel is still alive. We already read about her death. Okay, but Rachel is still alive because he says, what, are I and your mother and your brother's going to come bow down before you? And when I teach that, and people say, but there's 11 stars. So obviously we're talking about the 11 brothers. So Benjamin must have been born. And I said, but no, there's 11 stars because he had 10 other sons and a daughter. Okay, and how do we know that the daughter is still living there? We're going to get later in the chapter. I'll point that out to you, so we can really see the time frame in which this happened, how far we've backed up into the story to tell this part. Some people would say that's not important, but I think we need to know the context of what we're reading. The two responses we see here, we see the response of the brethren, the response of the brothers. We have the response of the father. Now, the brethren are younger, less mature. The father is older, more mature, is walking with Yehovah very closely at this point. Okay? The brethren, become more angry. They hate him more than they hated him before. The father becomes agitated with him and then steps back and just kind of keeps it in mind and says, you know what? Maybe I better pay attention to what's going on here. It is unfortunately a natural part of our flesh that when we see someone else being blessed in a special way, that we say, hey, why can't I have that? But if we are mature in our faith, we will stop ourselves and we will back up and say, maybe I better pay attention to see what Elohim is doing here, because this is beyond me. One time, when his brothers had gone to pasture their father's flock at Shechem, so Israel and his people are still at Shechem. Were they still at Shechem after the situation with Dinah? Were they still at Shechem after Simeon and Levi went in and did what they did? No, they left that area. Okay, so the fact that they're still there tells us that this is before that instance, which tells us that that 11th star is Dinah. Because after this instance, she would not have been considered part of Yisrael. Or after that instance, I mean. Yisrael said to Yosef, your brothers are pasturing at Shechem. Come, I will send you to them. He answered, I am ready. And he said to him, go and see how your brothers are and how the flocks are faring, and bring me back word. So he sent him from the valley of Hebron. When he reached Shechem, a man came upon him wandering in the fields. The man asked him, what are you looking for? He answered, I am looking for my brothers. Could you tell me where they are pasturing? The man said, they have gone from here, for I heard them say, let us go to Dothan. So Yosef followed his brothers and found them at Dothan. They saw him from afar, and before he came close to them, they conspired to kill him. You know, I've walked into some mainline churches and felt a whole lot like Yosef. When the elders call me up and say, we've been listening to you on the internet. We want you to come in and teach all this Old Testament stuff so we understand it better. And you get there, and the deacons, who in a lot of the mainline churches actually run the place, and they're already figuring out how to get you out. Or how to get me out. Yeah, okay, I've run into that. And I think when you go into a place where there's not been a whole lot of truth, where people are afraid of the truth because it's outside their doctrinal understanding, better be careful, because you may be coming up on your brothers, but they may be Yosef's brothers. Okay? Run into that a lot. They said to one another, here comes that dreamer. You ever heard that? Believer gets a mission, a ministry laid on his or her heart. Okay? Something they just know they're supposed to do for Elohim. And all the people whose don't want to get behind it, they use the excuse. They say, oh, he's just a dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits, and we can say a savage beast devoured him. We shall see what comes of his dreams. Oh, they're about to see, all right. But when Reuben heard it, he tried to save him from them. Interesting point here. Reuben, the firstborn, the rightful inheritor, the one who, by tradition, should have received the tunic of bands, is the only one to say, let's not kill the inheritor who received the tunic of bands. And this is the son who goes down in history as being the unrighteous son. When we talk about someone among the tribes who does unholy things, and we say they must be of Reuben because of what he did. Because of what he did to disgrace his father with his father's other wife. And he gets tagged with that, and no one remembers he was the only brother to try to save Yusef's life. And if he was the only brother to do that, and he was so unrighteous and unholy as to do what he did later, what does that say about the other brothers? Instead of saying that people who do things they ought not do must be of Reuben, maybe we should be saying they must be of any tribe but Reuben. He tried to save him from them. He said, let us not take his life. And Reuben went on, shed no blood. Cast him into that pit out in the wilderness, but do not touch him yourselves, intending to save him from them and restore him to his father. Did you catch that? He wasn't just trying to save his life. He was trying to restore him to their father, in whose eyes this younger brother had taken his place. When Yusef came up to his brothers, they stripped Yusef of his tunic, the ornamented tunic that he was wearing, and took him and cast him into the pit. The pit was empty. There was no water in it. As I read the Hebrew, I think this may have been more like a cistern than an actual just a pit, more instead of a sinkhole. May have been that they had found like some soft stone in the middle of some hard stone somebody had and dug it out so that they could have a quarried cistern, but there was no water in it at that time. Then they sat down to a meal. You ever wonder how people can do that? What kind of heart do you have when you have just done something so evil as to plot the murder of your own brother, and you sit down to dinner together? And yet I know families that are just like that. Especially when grandma and grandpa are dying, and you got the ones over here conspiring against the ones over there. Who's getting the farm? Who's getting the bank account? Who's getting the antiques to sell them? And as soon as they, I knew a guy called himself a minister. I wouldn't call him that. Of course, if you ask him, I'm not either. He literally was caught red-handed stealing from a widow on her deathbed, was caught by her children. He was supposed to be there visiting her, was taking antiques that were worth a lot of money out of her house to sell them, was caught. When the police came to his house later to arrest him, he was sitting down to dinner with his wife and kids like nothing had happened. What has to be in your heart to do something like that? And to be so callous as to just go on with life? I mean, if I did something like that, I think it would keep me awake, unable to sleep until I went and made right with it. Looking out, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelim coming from Gilead, their camels bearing gum, balm, and ladanum to be taken to Mitzrayim. Then Yehudah said to his brothers, "What do we gain by killing our brother and covering up his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelim, but let us not do away with him ourselves. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh." Okay, so one other brother seems to have a conscience. His brother agreed. When Midyamin traders passed by, they pulled Yosef up out of the pit. They sold Yosef for 20 pieces of silver to the Ishmaelim and brought Yosef to Mitzrayim. When Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Yosef was not in the pit, he rent his clothes. You know, it's always said that all of the brothers betrayed him. This tells me that Reuben did not know what was done to him. He actually thought Yosef was dead. Returning to his brothers, he says, "The boy is gone. Now what am I to do?" Then they took Yosef's tunic, slaughtered a kid, and dipped the tunic in the blood. Now, why would Reuben ask the question, now what am I supposed to do? Well, I think there's several reasons. Number one, he's the eldest. Whose head is this going to come down on? If anybody, who's going to pay the price? Reuben. Even if Yosef was dead from an animal slaughtering him, who is going to be held responsible? Reuben. Who thought that he was going to gain favor in the eyes of his father by saving the life of the favored son? Reuben. They had the ornamented tunic taken to their father, and they said, "We found this. Please examine it. Is it your son's tunic or not?" He recognized it and said, "My son's tunic. A savage beast devoured him. Yosef was torn by a beast." Yaakov rent his clothes, put sackcloth on his loins, and observed mourning for his son many days. All his sons and daughters sought to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted, saying, "No, I will go down mourning to my son in Sheol." Thus his father bewailed him. Now I want to point out to you, this word Sheol, a lot of times in English, this is translated to hell. Okay, that's not really what this word means. Sheol means the grave. Okay, he's not saying I'm going down into hell. So if you're reading an English translation that says hell, that's not what he's referring to. He's talking about the grave. Literally, means something that is underground. In Old English, when this word became later, as it was brought in through the translation process, it was carried over into the Old English, and literally people would talk about their root cellars and call it Sheol. Okay, because it's just a dark place under the ground where everything's buried. The other thing I want you to think about is most of the sons knew he wasn't dead. And it says they went and they tried to comfort him. Why didn't they just say, okay, Daddy's not really dead? You know, I've had my children do things that displeased me. But as much as when what they did displeased me, when they came and were honest with me, it pleased me. Now, they might still have had a price to pay, a penalty, got sent to their room, got a swat on the bottom, what have you. But my children, the older ones who are old enough to understand, know that there's always going to be love at the end of that. There's always going to be grace. If they come to me and they tell me what they did wrong and they try to make right on it, there's always going to be that open door of love. And I believe that Yaakov was that kind of father. And if they had come and said, Dad, we've done this horrible thing. But the good news is Yosef is still alive and we can get him back. Let's go to Mitzrayim. Now, he would have been unhappy with him. But he would have taken everything he had and he would have gone up to Mitzrayim and got his son back. The Midyamin, meanwhile, sold him in Mitzrayim to Potiphar, a courtier of Pharaoh and his chief steward. Now, I want to tell you something here, and I had never caught this until I was reading through this, and I happened to be rereading a book on history of the tribe of Yehudah as we've gone into diaspora, specifically a book about my wife's lineage. Okay, and I just happened to be reading the part about the high steward and how that plays in, and how the high steward who was of Yehudah has been basically able to hold together enough of a safe haven that those 9.5 tribes can continue to exist, even if they're in hiding, even if they don't know who they are right now. And as I'm reading this book, it's an amazingly well-written book. I would loan it to anybody who wants to borrow it. And as I'm reading through that section, I'm also studying for this message today, and I'm seeing the correlation between what happened to him, Yosef, being sold to the high steward and coming under his protection. And of course, we know that later on he basically becomes the high steward, but he becomes above him, becomes the governor. And if you read the book that I'm talking about, you'll see an amazing parallel there of what happened in my wife's family and what happens to Yosef in the scripture. I believe that there's probably a great foreshadowing there of the protection of the 9.5 tribes. Do we have a midrash?